Hi, I'm Gareth Kane, and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today I'm joined by Paul Brannen, a former member of the European Parliament, a director of public affairs at not one or two, but three wood industry bodies, and author of the book Timber: How Wood Can Save the World from Climate Breakdown. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you, Gareth.
So, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves by explaining how they first got involved in environmental issues, and then, if appropriate, how that moved on to you championing wood as a climate solution.
Okay, so at university, I got very involved in student politics, ended up being president of the Students' Union, involved particularly in the anti-apartheid movement, and went on to work for anti-apartheid in London, and then to Christian Aid. So for a long time, I worked in the NGO world on development issues, but on the advocacy and campaigning side. So looking at the causes of poverty and then running campaigns on them. So third world debt, fair trade, policies of the World Bank and the IMF. And then I moved on from there and was working for a sort of ginger group known as Common Purpose, a sort of charity trying to get cities and towns to work better as a result of senior decision makers from the public and the private sector having an appreciation and understanding of each other's areas of work. And then I got a phone call from Christian Aid to say my old job was coming up again, head of campaigns, head of advocacy, and would I be interested in coming back to Christian Aid because they were planning to do a major campaign on climate change. Mm-hmm. And Christian Aid was the first of the UK development agencies to work on climate change, and subsequently Oxfam, Save the Children, CAFOD, etc., did also. But Christian Aid was the first to make that move. Mm. And I went back to Christian Aid, took up my old job again, and planned and launched a major campaign on climate change, and did that for best part of 5-6 years. And from there, I became a member of the European Parliament. So when I went into the European Parliament, I was keen to continue to work on the climate issue in the broad sense. Mm-hmm. I was appointed to the Agriculture Committee and to the Environment Committee, so two separate committees, and climate change sat across them both as a big issue. And one of the connecting issues was the whole area of forestry. And the first specific piece of work, as I did as a member of the European Parliament, representing the northeast of England, was a review of the European forest strategy. Yeah. And that involved going to visit forestry in different countries around Europe, including in the UK. And that was my first sort of introduction, if you like, to the world of wood, forests producing timber, and that connection to the battle against climate change. And when Brexit came along and needed a new job, I was approached by the timber industries, the sawmill industry in Europe, to say, would I take on a advocacy to the European Parliament in relation to the issues that I'd already been working on, but from the other side of the fence. So I became poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher, whichever it is. So went from being a politician to being, in effect, a lobbyist, but on issues that I felt dearly about, climate change in the broad sense, but the role of timber in tackling climate breakdown specifically.
Right. I always find it amusing that during, say, the Brexit campaign, that we were always told that, sort of unelected bureaucrats in Brussels were pushing all this environmental law on us, environmental rules and regulations, but it was actually people like you who we had elected to go and represent us on the European Parliament who were drawing up those European laws. So it was very democratic. But I think I'm right that European elections got some of the smallest turnouts in the various elections that we had at the time. So there seemed to be that disconnect. Would that be fair between the general public and what the European Parliament did?
Well, we certainly found as MEPs from all parties that coverage of what went on in Brussels and Strasbourg was pretty low down the media agenda in the UK. So consequently, not surprisingly, a large number of people in the UK didn't really know what we were doing, and therefore what was the point of engaging in European elections, etc. Having said that, turnout in European elections in the UK was normally higher than in council elections, but obviously not as high as a general election. So sort of somewhere in between, and it varies around the EU, but with a turnout of around about 50% on average. So
I
could
stand
do
corrected.
better, but could be worse.
I thought it was lower than that, but I must admit I hadn't researched that, so it was going off the top of my head. So I stand corrected. So yes, so you work for these three bodies. I didn't list them all at the start because I reckoned I would stumble over them in my introduction, but perhaps you could introduce them and say what all three do.
So the first is Cibois, which French, if you like. And that's the European Woodworking Network. So each European country has a national wood body. In the UK, it's Timber Development UK, based in London, representing the whole country's timber issues. And those bodies come together at a European level and have a European advocacy role towards the European institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, and whoever's chairing the EU at the time on that 6-month rotating presidency, country by country. Then there's EOS, which is the European Organization of the Sawmillers, and that's another second European network that works very closely with the first, Cibois. And then in the UK, I also do advocacy work towards the UK Parliament on behalf of the Confederation of Timber Industries, the CTI. The Confederation of Timber Industries is made up of Timber Development UK, the Structural Timber Association, and CONFOR, the Confederation of Forest Industries. So it's a way of bringing together the sort of UK forestry and wood world, and then doing some advocacy work, particularly at a Westminster level. So they're the three bodies. I do a small amount of work for each of those. And in addition to that, sort of running in parallel since the end of last year, I've been a commissioner for the Forestry Commission in England.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I left that off your CV. It's a very lengthy CV and all this experience, but you can see how all those different parts of the jigsaw fit together nicely. And then you also found time to write a book, Timber: How Wood Can Save the World from Climate Breakdown. So was there a particular spur to write that, or what was the origin story of the book?
So the book came out of the fact that I'd been working on forestry and wood issues at a European level for 5 years, and then I went to work in the wider industry, timber and forestry, and after doing that for a couple of years, I felt that the 7 years worth of knowledge and experience and visits, conversations, etc., was sort of coming together in a potential book. And I was doing quite a lot of public speaking engagements, people asking me to go and talk about what role for wood in tackling climate change. And I was aware of what would be the standard questions that people ask. So you do your presentation, and if that presentation doesn't mention the risk of fire in relation to timber billings, you know that it'll probably be the first question that you get asked.
Yeah.
And likewise, standard question would be, that's all very interesting, Paul, but is there enough wood to build more houses out of wood? So that would be the other big question. So I felt as if I knew what the questions were and also knew what the answers were, and sketched it out in the Free Trade Inn in the Ousburn, if the truth be told, was where the first putting onto paper what would the relevant chapters be if I was to write a book on the role of timber in construction. And I think what really did motivate me to do it was my growing understanding over that period of 7 years was that wood could make a significant contribution to tackling climate breakdown. And we're not just talking about 2 or 3%. This is at least 15% of the answer to climate change, and if not 20% and more. And no one had brought it all together in one place and set it down and said, look, this is the problem. basically, I don't need to spend very much time on that because we know what the problem is, climate change. And here is a significant solution to it, which I think either people know nothing about at all, or they do know something about it, but they underestimate how big a contribution a shift to building more with timber could deliver.
Yeah.
And that was the purpose of the book. And it was to take those kind of discussions and that understanding, which is in the margins, and get it into the mainstream.
Yeah. So my first question is, take the US. Using wood for construction is perfectly normal. Here in the UK, it's quite rare. If somebody builds a house out of wood, it's something you would remark on. Is that a cultural issue, or is it just because there's more wood available in the US?
I have to come back to you on the wording of your question.
All right.
If you'd said England
Yeah.
and Wales, you'd have been correct. Because in Scotland, for a long time, and certainly in the recent period, more than 90% of family homes in Scotland are built with a timber frame.
Right.
So you only need to go 150 miles north of Newcastle and you're in timber frame land, along with Scandinavia, North America, Canada, and the US, where in the non-urban areas, all family homes basically are built with a timber frame. Yeah. So it's a very, very common way of building family housing outside of city centres in a significant part of the Northern Hemisphere. And for a mixture of reasons, partly to do with convention and conservatism in an approach to house building, England and Wales have not been building. In fact, it's less than 10% in England and Wales of houses are built with timber frames. However, that is changing, and changing really quite quickly. So you take a company like Bellway, who are based in Newcastle in the northeast of England. They build houses in Scotland and they build houses in England. Mm-hmm. So for the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, all of their houses in Scotland have had a timber frame. You come south of the border and they flip the other way around. 90% of them don't. Yeah. But in the beginning of this year, 2026, Bellway opened their own in-house timber frame facility in Nottinghamshire. And they are now producing timber frames for the English market for Bellway houses built in England. Yeah. And 8 of the 15 largest house builders in the UK now have, and the majority of those houses are being built in England, now have either the ability to access a supply of timber frames from a third party, or they are, in one way or another, developing their own in-house way of producing timber frames. And at the moment, we can, in the UK, do about 40,000 timber framed houses. Yeah. We're very close to getting to 50. I mean, this year we will hit 50,000. And the capacity, so the Bellway plant is running 1 shift 5 days a week, but could run 3 shifts and could work weekends. So it has that capacity to go up. And collectively, the capacity is approaching 100,000 for the UK as a whole. So 2-3 years from now, we'll be able to do 100,000. Wow. And that is significant. And that's a big change. So and it's coming about because it's faster. It's a faster way of building. Yeah. So you build the frame in the factory and you deliver it to site, and the house goes up more quickly and is watertight more quickly. And speed means you get your money earlier. Yeah. And then significantly, there are less snagging issues when the building's finished. You have a higher standard as a result of it being made in a factory before being brought to site. And that reduces costs further down the line and also adds to the speed. It, in addition, has environmental benefits, which we're about to come on to. Yeah. But as I say, 8 out of 15, it'll be 9, it'll be 12, it'll be all 15 of them in 2 or 3 years' time. Partly because they all copy each other.
Yeah. So is it? So it is that the speed and the lower cost of construction that's driving that. Is any of it, do you think, coming from the environmental benefits? You know, are consumers interested in knowing their houses?
There is now, and it depends on your view, but there is an increase, if you like, in the environmental standard to which houses need to be built. You could argue it needs to go a lot further. but at least the bar has been raised slightly, and timber frames help tick that box. So it's a way of the house builders being ready for to meet the, if you like, the coming legislation and future legislation. It is a greener way of building, and they know that, and therefore they're getting prepared for the way the wind's blowing, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned the environmental benefits. How much, quote, greener is a house made out of with a wood frame than
So there's
like,
two things you need to consider about building with wood, and this applies to bigger buildings in city centres, 3, 4, 5 stories, perfectly possible. We've got 18 stories is the tallest in the world at the moment in Norway. But we're starting off by talking about family homes. So what happens when you build with timber is you replace another material, the substitution effect.
yeah,
So if you're building a house with a timber frame, you're not building it with a brick and block frame.
yeah,
And bricks and blocks have to be made in ovens. They have to be baked. You need a lot of heat. And the temperature is such that in the main, you need to burn fossil fuels to get an oven hot enough in which to bake the bricks and the blocks.
yeah,
And that means those materials, bricks and blocks, but also steel and concrete, which demand a large amount of energy,
yeah,
have what is known as a very high level of embodied carbon. It's intrinsic to the manufacture of these materials that you will have to burn a fossil fuel. And that's embodied carbon. And that, in the battle against climate change, is a bad thing. And we need to reduce embodied carbon levels. So you take out the brick and the block and you put in a timber frame. And that's a substitution effect. And that's a big plus.
yeah,
But at the same time, the timber frame that you're using is storing carbon. So when the tree grew in the forest, the sequestration process, the photosynthesis that we remember from our biology lessons, of the carbon being absorbed by the tree and the oxygen being sent out to our benefit as human beings in response, that stored carbon, when the tree is felled, remains in the timber.
yeah,
So the timber growing, say, killed a forest, 35 years, we fell the trees. So 35 years of storage in the growing tree trunk. It then goes into a building where for another 35, 40, 50, maybe 100 years or longer, the carbon goes on being stored twice, 3 times longer than it was stored in the forest. And that carbon storage, that removal from the atmosphere and the storage process continues in the timber frame. So you need to add those two together to get your overall, benefit to the climate. And a typical national house builder timber frame is probably storing about 5 tons of carbon. That's a good thing. 5 tons of carbon being kept out of the atmosphere. And if you were to use a nature-based insulation, and at the moment, most of them are not doing this, but if you were to use, say, hemp or a wood fiber insulation, you could store another 2 or 3 tons. Some of them are using recycled newspaper as a way of insulating houses. So that paper is from the forest, it's from trees, and that's as recycled paper, because it's been recycled, it has no carbon footprint in the calculations.
yeah,
The carbon footprint would be associated with the manufacture of the newspaper in the first place. That's where it's accounted for. And recycling it, you're back to it being zero. But it is storing carbon. So there is the potential in all of these timber frames, which are now going up in England to match the ones in Scotland, of storing around about 8 tons in every single home. So 8 tons is significant, but where the real significance is, you're then taking 100,000 homes and timesing it by 8. So there you start to get into big storage figures, and that's a big plus in the battle against climate change. I recently visited Maca, who are a house builder in Inverness, using entirely UK-grown timber. They've built a prototype of a social housing house. So they're trying to get the price as low down as possible, but the quality and the carbon storage as high as possible. and they've got 39 tons of carbon stored in a 3-bedroom detached house.
Wow.
Significantly more,
Yeah.
4 or 5 times more than what we're getting in the National House Builder storage figures for timber frame. So if we were to roll more of those out, or even something in the middle, 20 tons of carbon in every family home, a
Yeah.
lot of stored carbon. So it's the storage and the substitution is what a timber frame brings to the climate debate. That's positive.
Yeah. The interesting thing I had was thinking about there when you mentioned the 35-year growth cycle is, and I spend a lot of time out in the countryside, a lot of time walking in forest plantations. That the people who are felling and processing and building houses with these trees, many of them wouldn't be alive when they were planted.
Yes, yeah.
You've
There
got
is,
this
yeah,
you've got this huge lead time,
yeah.
and I suppose at the minute we're relying on that sort of post-war forestry boom.
Yes, I mean it's a very long-term business,
Yeah,
but often it's we're talking about land use. How do we use the land? We could plant trees on it, decision to be made,
yeah,
or we could maybe farm it.
yeah,
And the advantage, although farmers may not see it like this, is farming is an annual process. So you can take a decision to change what crop you're going to have in the field for the following year. You can't do that on forestry. You've planted, you've committed. That's 35 years before you're going to see the produce, the
yeah,
fruits of your labor, and therefore we can see ahead. So at a UK level, we know we've got plenty of wood for the next 10, 20 or
yeah,
so years. And then we can start to see the supply potentially falling off because we haven't in recent years planted enough ready for 35 years' time. So one of the things that the government is trying to do is to increase tree planting in the UK, so that we can be assured that we do have enough timber going forwards.
yeah,
And I suppose the scary thing here is that if we take timber or wood products in its full range of usage, from newspaper, cardboard, all the way through to timber in the built environment, and also timber for energy, then we are importing 80% of our forest products. 80%.
right.
Well, if we compare that with food, it's about 50% of our food is imported, 80% of our forest products. So we are potentially, from a security point of view, really quite vulnerable to those supply chains being interrupted. And we can see that happening with oil at the moment and the war in the Middle East. Most of our timber is coming in from the Baltic, from Sweden and Finland, and the Baltic states, and a bit from Norway. So any particular problem to do with the Baltic being sealed off would have an immediate consequence on wood not arriving down the east coast of the UK. We're probably going to start getting more wood from Canada, because the Americans are no longer taking the Canadian wood, and the Canadians are looking for new markets. But we've
Yeah,
had a lot of Canadian timber in the past, and we shouldn't. And we need to remember that we get a lot of our wood from the Republic of Ireland. So they grow quite a lot of timber, but they have a small population. We have a big population with a big demand for wood. So a lot of Irish wood comes into the UK. So part of the reason for planting more trees is to make sure that the 80% doesn't go any higher. And ideally, it starts to come down a little bit.
yeah. And then there's the criticism always of that sort of type of softwood forestry is a lack of biodiversity. And in Scotland, there's a big push for rewilding some of these areas that were previously plantations. How does all that work out in practice?
So it's about trade-offs, and we have to consider each parcel of land or each piece of land, and work out what's maybe the best use for it. So, if we take the northeast of England, the lowland plain running down the coast, that's not where we should be planting conifer trees, nor should it be where we're planting native deciduous woodland, because that's our prime farmland, and we need that to grow our daily bread, quite specifically. And therefore, you start to come inland and you start to move up into the hills. And maybe that's a good place to be planting more native broadleaf forest, which we've seen a significant reduction of over the last 400-500 years. So we need to get more of that back. Yes, it's rich in biodiversity, but we also need to have commercial timber. And traditionally that would then be grown, say, if you like, further up the hill. Yeah. So northeast of England, we have a large amount of sheep farming, takes up a lot of land. Is that the most productive way of using that land to produce a relatively small amount of meat?
Yeah.
When that land maybe be well suited to the planting of commercial forestry, because we do need timber. And if we think that we should just be importing more and more of our timber, there's the strategic vulnerability of that. But you're also simply offshoring your timber production. So somebody else's land is growing the trees. So I think that's not on either. I mean, we need to be thinking, how do we make the best use of our land in the UK? And without doubt, more of that land should have commercial timber on it. But some of it should be more mixed forestry. And we're certainly looking at the concept of continuous forest cover, where you don't fell large sections, you just fell individual trees. So at any given time, there are no noticeable sections of felled woodland. So that's another way of approaching this, which has advantages for biodiversity. That said, there's often a trade-off. So if the biodiversity goes up, you may find that your wood production goes down. Yeah. It's not necessarily always the case. So biodiversity has been steadily rising, say, at Kielder in recent years because of improvements in practices. But the wood production per hectare has also been going up. So it's not necessarily an either or. And I think the Forestry Commission in England, but also the equivalent body in Scotland and Wales, we are some of the world's leading experts on how you can increase the production of timber and increase biodiversity.
Yeah.
The obvious example at Kielder in England is the last major stronghold of the red squirrel.
Yeah.
And it's predominantly commercial woodland. And people need to recognize that. Now, it is the case that in the past, and when I say the past, we're talking 15, 20, 30 years ago and longer, that you might have planted on quite a large area 100% Sitka spruce, single species. We simply wouldn't do that now. We know about the vulnerability of a single species to disease and potentially to climate change. So we want our commercial forests as well as our native forests to be much more mixed in their composition.
Yeah.
So the percentage of Sitka has come down. But it would still, if we were planting a new forest, which we have done relatively recently at Doddington near Wooler, it still is the dominant species. It's the single largest species because it produces really good quality timber, good enough to build houses with, and really quickly. The Sitka spruce absorbs more carbon more quickly than any other tree.
Yeah.
Than any other tree. So if we're in a climate crisis, we should be planting a lot of Sitka spruce. Well, we shouldn't be planting 100% Sitka spruce. I mean, I'd like to see more Sitka spruce in our towns and cities.
Yeah.
Not because we'd be growing it for wood, because we'd be growing it because it absorbs carbon very quickly. And we need to be doing more of that. And the last thing on this is certainly as into that higher land, you often come across peat. And we have a large amount of peat in the northeast of England. And we need to take great care of it. And in the past, we planted trees on it when we shouldn't have done if we'd known the climate implications. We now do. So when a stand of trees is felled in the northern uplands of England and in Scotland, a decision is taken about whether the land can be replanted, and it won't be replanted if there's deep peat.
Yeah.
The peat will be restored and the water table will rise. And that's the right thing to do. My view would be, for every hectare that comes out to be moved over correctly to peat, a hectare somewhere else should be brought into commercial forest production.
Yeah, because of course peat is such a carbon sink. my probably lone professional involvement in the wood industry was about 15 years ago, where I was looking, and people will guess listening to this that we're both based in the northeast of England, looking at wood flows in the economy in the northeast of England, to see if where value could be added. And one of the things I remember was the sometimes visceral anger from the sector at the biomass sector, using wood chip for energy, and we burn a lot of it in Drax at the minute. Is that still seen as a complete no within the wood industry? Do they want to keep wood being wood and process it into fiberboard, or is there a role from energy from waste in the overall model?
Yeah, so you're right to identify the burning of wood as a contentious issue in relation to creating energy. At a European level, we burn about 50% of our wood, which is quite a surprising figure. And a relatively small percent of the 50% that we don't burn makes its way into long life harvested wood products, such as timber in construction. And I think there's a general agreement that is maybe one of the best ways of using wood, is to produce a product which then lasts for a very long time. The green NGOs, they think that's a great idea, and we should be doing more of it. But it is a relatively low percentage at the moment. And part of my interest in this area is how do we increase that percentage and the overall amount that goes into long-term products, because then you get the long-term storage. But we need to be realistic here. Certainly in the case of the UK, it was great news, what was it, 2 years ago, when we burnt our last coal to produce energy. The UK was the first place in the world that burnt coal to create energy. And the northeast of England was at the center of that coal industry. And we were the first country in the world who had been burning coal to get out of burning coal. And part of the way in which we were able to do that was we have used wood as a transition fuel to get us from where we are to where we need to get to.
Yeah.
And I think people need to know that the wood that goes to Drax Power Station, which produces about 8% of the UK's electricity, but also to other large power stations like Linemouth that used to burn coal on the Northumberland coast, which now burns wood pellets. Those pellets are all imported. So the majority of the wood that is burnt in the UK to produce electricity is imported from North America or elsewhere in Europe. So it's not UK wood that is being burnt. It's the smaller power stations like the one at Cramlington, where wood from Kielder and wood from the northeast of England, logs that could have gone to Egger to make chipboard, which would then make kitchens, which would last for 15 years and then can be recycled and do another 15 years, and then can be recycled and do another 15 years. Those logs from Kielder can go there, but some of them are also going to Cramlin to be burnt for energy. And I think that does raise some questions. I think the question really is that long-term what we want to do? And I would say no, there are better uses. But I understand why it's happening in the short to medium term until we transition. We've done the coal transition. We now need to do the wood transition. That said, there will always be a place for burning some wood for some energy. In the context of the UK, is if you have a factory making wood panels or a sawmill, you will need energy to run that factory. Yeah. And there is a sensible logic in burning your side streams, the bits that are left over, your sawdust that you're not using to make the product, for burning that to create some energy to be able to run your plant. And I think that's fine.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that. Yeah,
and there's a lot of logic to doing that. And Egger at Hexham, one of our big chipboard manufacturers, but there's also similar MDF factories around the country and OSB factories. Yeah. They're doing the same. And Hexham potentially has surplus heat, which theoretically could be piped under the river into Hexham and be used to do the heating of the hospital or a district heating system. So there's a place for it. Then you need to bear in mind the much bigger geographical countries. So if you're in the north of Sweden or the north of Finland, you're a long way from market.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you're producing timber, and the value of the timber is such that you can put it on a rail or a lorry and send it south, and maybe even then going on to the UK, and you can make money from doing that. But what do you do with the side streams, with the bits that are left over there in the north of Sweden, in the north of Finland?
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, economically, the sensible thing to do it is burn it, turn it into electricity, and then send the electricity down the cables into the electricity grid for the south of those countries where the majority of their population live. So there will always be a place for the burning of some wood to create energy, and it may be the most efficient way of using it. And you've got a similar situation in the United States where paper mills have closed down. We don't read newspapers in the same way as we used to. The demand for paper has gone down. So paper mills have closed. You've got forests that have grown up to provide the paper mills. What do you now do with that timber?
Yeah.
And one of the things you could do, and it makes economic and in some cases environmental sense, is to burn it to create electricity, which can be then cabled and delivered to a much greater distance in an economically viable way. So we need to, it's a mix and match system.
Yeah.
But I would be disappointed if the likes of Drax were still doing what it's doing in 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah. And again, going back to the 35-year growth cycle, these social and economic trends, like people not reading as many newspapers, can happen over a much shorter period. So the system must be constantly adjusting, given that that we can't just go out if there was a sudden surge. We can't just go out and plant more trees and harvest them next year. It's another couple of generations before they can actually use it. So,
but that's right. Although the big picture,
yeah.
the big picture is that we are collectively, as a country and as a world,
yeah.
moving from a fossil fuel economy to a bioeconomy.
Yeah.
So the gas, the oil, the coal needs to be replaced with products which we can grow in the natural environment in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
And timber is one of those leading materials.
Mm-hmm.
The demand for timber is just going to go up across the board. So, for instance, while paper demand has gone down, cardboard demand has shot up because of people shopping online and pretty much everything arriving in a cardboard box.
Yeah.
So demand for card has gone up. There's going to be more demand for more timber to build more houses with. And things like seaweed grown in a marine environment. These are the kind of materials that we're going to need more of going forward. So they'll need to come from either the forest, the farm, or the sea.
Yeah.
So you're replacing your gas and your oil and your coal with something from the farm, something from the forest, or something from the sea. And timber at the moment is the material, the number one material that more and more people want. So for instance, down on Teesside, where they're doing some work to look at how do we produce a sustainable aviation fuel, their number one material of choice is Sitka spruce.
Yeah. Again, because it grows so quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And ultimately, is all this going to be driven by economics, or how much of a policy influence is there on that sort of wood economy?
So different people will answer that question in different ways, and I'm pretty conscious of that. I think the number one thing that is needed is a level playing field.
Yeah.
And there's various areas of the market where the forest and timber industry believe that it's not a level playing field.
Mm-hmm.
So an example would be if you build a new building, you don't pay VAT on it.
Yeah.
If you want to refurbish an existing building, you pay VAT on it.
Yeah.
And the refurbishment market is a very big timber market. So you're talking about existing buildings that are being either refurbished or extended, or maybe both. And there's a big role for timber, and you will have to pay tax on using that timber. But if you decide to knock the building down, build a new one, which from an environmental point of view is absolutely what we should not be doing, and you build that building from concrete and steel or brick and block, you don't pay any VAT on it. That's not a level playing field. So that's an example of where we think there does need to be changes, but not to give any advantage to the timber industry, just to give us that level playing field. And at the moment, you don't pay, there's no tax on building a building which is bad for the environment.
Yeah.
You're allowed to do that by law.
Yes.
And there is no advantage financially in building a building which is good for the environment. So one of the things we would like to see is, in the first instance, as part of the planning process, you would need to tell the planners, the local authority, and therefore the wider public, what the embodied carbon per square meter of your proposed build was going to come out at. So that would be part of the process. Now, in the first instance, I think it could be as high as you like. We're not saying that we would set a level, but in time we are going to have to set at levels, and we're going to have to bring them down so that we can't go on building buildings with very large carbon footprints. I had the rather extraordinary experience. We know because we're Newcastle based, but for people listening from elsewhere in the country, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs have a very fine and very large new building in the centre of Newcastle, right in the centre of Newcastle. And when the construction began, what was it, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I wrote to HMRC and said, what will be the embodied carbon footprint of the new build when it's finished? And I got a reply to say that they can't tell me that, but they would be able to tell me once it was finished. It is now finished, and I have now got the answer to that question. And as I expected, it has a very large carbon footprint because it's full of glass, lots of energy, steel, lots of energy, and concrete, lots of energy, all using fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of building that we should be no longer building.
Yes.
Because it's very bad for the environment when it could have been a building which helped the environment. But I only found that out, and they only knew once the building was finished. And that's not good enough. We need to know upfront, and in due course, in the next 3, 4, 5 years, some people would say we need to do it straight away, is we need to start setting limits. So every square meter, every square foot you build, then there needs to be a cap on how much carbon can be emitted in doing that. And that would be to the huge benefit of nature-based materials such as wood.
Yeah. And you would have thought that that information would be available at the sort of planning stage, because modern construction techniques with bill of materials, all automated 4D modeling of the construction process. There's so much data there. Yeah. There's plenty of publicly available data on the embodied carbon of different materials. You would have thought that the information would be readily available.
Yeah. No, we're not there yet. And also, even if we were, if somebody came along and said, I'm going to build this building out of aluminium.
Yeah.
And you think, what? It's going to have like the largest level of embodied carbon per square meter of any building in the world. You're still allowed to do it if you want to do it. And it's not a reason for not granting planning permission.
Yeah.
And that needs to change, clearly.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I was going to ask you the sort of final question, as if you had a magic wand, what would you change? I assume that would be one of those areas, is getting that into planning policy. But what other things would you like to see change to sort of accelerate this move that you were talking about towards wooden construction across the UK, not just in Scotland?
So we've talked predominantly about family homes, and it's quite clear that we could build the majority of our family homes, and we're going to be building a lot of them because we have a housing crisis across the whole of the UK, using timber frames and using a nature-based insulation, which could be wood fibre, but it could be hemp or wool, it's sheep's wool, etc. And that's and we can kind of see a trajectory for that happening. But then there's the question of our inner city areas where land prices are much higher, where you wouldn't be building semi-detached family homes. You're building larger apartment blocks for people to live in. Back in 2009, the UK had the lead. We had the tallest timber apartment building in the world. We had 9 stories at Murray Grove in Hackney in London. And it was a world leader. And architects from all over the place came to see it and to see what was possible. And it was clearly possible we could go higher. That proved 9 stories, 15 stories was also going to be possible. The building proved it. Very low level of embodied carbon compared to a concrete and steel equivalent. Lots of advantages, a quicker build time, a quieter build time, less dust and noise, because when you're cutting wood, it's not as noisy as cutting steel, etc. Massive substitution effect. And Hackney, the council where this building went up, had a sustainability planning policy. So it didn't say you had to build with wood, but it had a sustainability criteria. And the easiest way to meet the criteria was to build in wood.
Yeah.
And as a result, 25, 30 buildings then went up in the years ahead in Hackney, school, cinema, places of worship, as well as accommodation. And that still is the largest concentration of large timber buildings in the world is in London and in Hackney.
Yeah.
And then the Grenfell fire disaster happened. Horrific. Over 70 people burned to death in their own homes. Horrific. And understandably, there was a response to that. But in some ways, it was the wrong response because there was a ban on using all combustible materials in buildings over 18 meters tall in London, but to all effect, the country as a whole. And timber is a flammable material. Now, a timber building, even a large timber building, is no more susceptible to fire than a building built from concrete and steel.
Yeah.
Primarily because of the contents of a building. The structure doesn't catch fire first, it's the contents. And you can still have flammable contents in any building in London, no matter how high. So it's not going to stop fires in buildings, and it's not going to stop tall buildings having fires in them. But there was no timber structurally in Grenfell, but structurally timber is now penalised. And 18 meters means you can build basically about 5 stories.
Yeah.
And what has happened since in London is 5 stories of office accommodation is being built. And there's some great examples. The black and white building in the East End, the Paradise building next to Waterloo Railway Station, beautiful buildings built from engineered timber, office blocks. So we've had no multiple story apartment accommodation blocks built in London since the Grenfell fire disaster. And you just need to go on the internet and put in tall timber buildings, Canada, United States, Australia, Germany, France, you name it. We're getting left behind. Yeah. So there's I've lost count now and I used to try and keep a tally. There was a point at which I'd visited the 7 tallest timber buildings in the world. I'd been to all of them. Yeah. And I couldn't possibly do it now. I'd be traveling every day. And my carbon footprint would be massive, and it would just prohibitively expensive. So it's great news. Building tall, building big with timber is taking off. Yeah. Including for accommodation. In Norway, the tallest timber building in the world at 18 stories. It's a hotel on the ground floor, private apartments on the top floors, office accommodation in the middle. And one of the offices in there is Norway's largest insurance company. Yeah. they wouldn't be in there if there was any more worry about a tall timber building than a tall concrete or steel building from a fire perspective. Perfectly safe if built properly, like any other building from any other material, if built properly. Grenfell was not built properly. That's why there was a problem. Wasn't a timber building, wasn't built properly, fire. If you built a timber building not properly, tall timber building, there could be a fire. Yeah. So we just have to plan that out at the architectural stage, and it's perfectly possible to do. So we want the return of that level playing field, of the ability to build. We don't want, some people get, excited about taller and taller timber buildings. The reality is we want to be able to build mid-rise timber buildings, 6, 7, 8, 9 stories. And we'd like to do that pretty much in every major town and city in the United Kingdom. We don't need to be building over 10 stories. We just don't. If there's a few such buildings in the city centres of London, Birmingham, so be it. But that's not what we're after. We're just after the ability in law to build mid-rise timber frame buildings. And at the moment, we're not allowed to do that. And I think that being allowed to do that, combined with what's happening anyway with timber framed homes, then we can see the way forward. All the experiences that when people go into one of these larger timber buildings, especially where the timber's exposed, is they love the building. That black and white building, which I mentioned, built in the East End of London, during the build process, as inevitable, whatever you're building it out, the costs were going up. And the person buying the building said, is there any way you could just bring those costs down a bit to the architects who specialized in building in wood? Maybe you could use a bit of steel instead of all of this wood. To which the architect said, no way, we build in wood. If you want to have other materials, we're off, you can get somebody else. So it was a bit acrimonious, actually. And the building was finished. The owner, which is the Office Group, which is a large amount of office space across London where you can rent by the hour or the day or the week, post-COVID, very popular rather than having your own permanent building. Office Group bit cheesed off at this price being a bit more than they wanted it to be. Then they had the building valued, and it came in at 11% more than they thought it was going to be worth. Absolutely delighted, because it's such a beautiful building. You go in, you want to touch the walls. There's a lovely smell of wood. Of all of the Office Group's buildings, and the rest of them are not wooden buildings, they're concrete and steel buildings, they have the highest occupancy rate. And it's because it's a beautiful building, and it's beautiful because it's made of wood.
People want to live and work in nice places, don't they? Right. Well, that's been fascinating, Paul. We're coming up against your hard stop time here. So just really leaves me to thank you for all those insights. I think we covered a huge amount of ground, particularly around the construction sector, but also the broader wood economy. So thank you very much for sharing with that.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Gareth.